Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're taking a shortcut into some of the most complex and definitely most sensitive material we've ever looked at.
That's putting it mildly.
Our mission here is to really pull out the core ideas from two powerful sources, both detailing these strategies for social engineering and economic control.
Right. And our main source for this discussion is based on analysis by the linguist and activist Noam Chomsky. He often references strategies that were codified in this document called Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars, or SWFW.
And we should be really clear here. We're looking at the content of these sources, impartially. We're focusing on the concepts they're presenting, not endorsing them.
Absolutely. The SWFW document itself is just a fascinating thing to look at. It's supposedly from May 1979, allegedly found 6 years later on IBM property.
And it's basically a manual.
Exactly, but not for, traditional warfare with bombs and tanks. It's for a non-traditional computerized war waged against the population.
And its mission, its stated ultimate mission, is just cold and clear.
It is. The source describes this necessary transfer of what it calls social energy, which, we can think of as collective wealth, productive capacity, from what the document calls the irresponsible and undisciplined majority to a disciplined and responsible minority.
So our goal today is to give you a really deep understanding of the mechanics, the psychology, the history of these control systems, and the economic math supposedly used to wage this quiet war.
Yeah.
So let's dive into the strategies, the ones designed to keep the public manageable.
Let's do it.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the foundational tactics, the ones for keeping the public, intellectually compliant. The most vital one, the source says, is simply diversion and distraction.
Yeah, and it sounds obvious, right? But the mechanism is so powerful. This isn't just about, avoiding serious news. It's about distracting the public so completely from the real issues.
Like structural changes being made by elites.
Exactly, distracting them so much that they don't even have the mental bandwidth left to form a critique.
They actually describe it as keeping the public busy, busy, busy with no time to think.
It's about creating cognitive overload. You're always focused on some immediate, trivial concern, whether it's, entertainment, your credit card debt, some manufactured social anxiety.
And if you're always busy with that, you never get around to learning the important stuff.
That's the corollary. It prevents the majority from accessing foundational, critical knowledge. I mean, if you're too busy arguing about a celebrity scandal, you're definitely not going to teach yourself the basics of economics or systems design or automatic control.
And that knowledge gap becomes the power gap.
That's it. Which sets the stage for the next strategy, the one we hear about whenever a crisis hits. Problem, reaction, solution.
Right. So you don't just solve a problem. You
Nah.
You create it, or at least you let it fester.
Exactly. You allow, say, social decay in cities, or you manufacture a severe economic panic that hits everyone's bank account, something that provokes a really strong, fear-driven public reaction.
People get scared. They're uncomfortable.
And because they're reacting with their emotions, they demand that the authorities do something, anything. They willingly accept pre-planned, often really restrictive measures.
Like sacrificing social rights or public services.
All in exchange for the promise of stability and security. They're essentially asking for the chain to be tightened.
Then there's gradualism. You call it the slow drain.
This is how you implement the really unpopular stuff. The things that would cause a revolution if you did them all at once.
So what's the psychology there? Why does it work so well?
It's human habituation. If you introduce something like mass unemployment or just growing economic precarity, but you do it slowly, incrementally over years, the source is 10 years. People just get desensitized.
The new, worse reality just becomes normal.
Well, it becomes the new normal, not an outrage. You adapt to it because you're only measuring the change from yesterday, not from a decade ago.
And related to that is deferral. Strategy 4. So if the slow drain is still too noticeable, you just kick the can down the road.
Yep. You introduce it as a necessary sacrifice, but for the future. Oh, this painful tax hike is coming, but not now, maybe next year.
That's a clever move. It targets hope.
Hope and inertia. The public thinks, oh, maybe things will get better or the problem will just go away. They put off the mental effort of resisting it, and in doing so, they basically consent to a future pain they haven't prepared for.
Okay, moving on to how they communicate. Strategy 5 is infantilization.
This is a deliberate tactic, addressing the public using rhetoric, images, characters that are, At a preteen level, you see it in politics, advertising, even the news.
It encourages regression.
Completely. When you talk to people like they're 12, they tend to engage with non-critical thinking. They become way more susceptible to simple suggestions. You just bypass rational thought entirely when the language is emotionally simple or even cartoonish.
Which brings us to a pair of strategies: emotional appeal and ignorance, number 6 and 7.
They go hand in hand. The emotional appeal is obvious. It short-circuits rational analysis. You target fear, desire, to get an immediate, unthinking reaction.
But the ignorance part is structural.
And the document is very explicit about this. The lower educational tiers must be intentionally kept weak. The goal is to make sure the general public stays incapable of understanding the specialized knowledge needed to analyze the very systems that govern their lives.
The economic, social, and tech systems.
Right. And this maintains this unbridgeable gap between the elite engineers and the masses they manage.
And then the last two, 8 and 9. These seem the most insidious from a, self-perception angle, promoting mediocrity and self-blame.
Yeah. This strategy encourages people to see their own intellectual laziness, their lack of education, or vulgar behavior not as bad things, but as desirable, as normal, or even authentic.
And then you add the final layer of control.
Which is convincing the individual that they are the sole reason for their own misfortune. It's your fault you're struggling because you're not smart enough or you don't work hard enough.
And that creates personal shame, depression.
Precisely. If you internalize a systemic failure as a personal failure, any outrage against the system just dissolves. It leads to inaction, apathy. And as the document says, that makes revolution impossible.
So those are the psychological controls, the what. Now we need to get into the how, the math and the tech behind turning society into a predictable machine. And this all starts with something called operational research, or OR, during World War II.
Right. OR was the military solution to really complex problems. It was a statistical method developed in the UK to study systems, maximize scarce resources, and get the highest possible efficiency against an enemy.
And the leap from military efficiency to controlling a whole society, that only became possible after the war because of 3 specific technological breakthroughs.
The first was the electronic computer, think Enanasi in 1946. The second was mathematical programming, especially the simplex method for optimization. And the third, the transistor in 1947.
Which let all that computing power become scalable.
And widespread, and this potential was not missed. The source points to the U.S. Air Force's involvement in Project Harvard, starting in '49.
And that was essentially the first big economic research project designed to achieve the science of economic control.
Over the entire American economy. But the theoretical basis for all of this, the key insight, is what the document calls the Rothschild discovery. It's a reference to that famous quote about controlling a nation's currency.
The real insight wasn't just that money is power. It was that instruments of debt and credit had the appearance of power.
Yes, and people, when they see this visible, engineered symbol of power, they willingly surrender their real wealth, their labor, their production, their land, all for promissory notes, for loans.
And that surrender is what allows for the centralized control of money flow.
It lets the ruling class dictate who gets capital and who doesn't. You basically control the mechanics of economic warfare.
What's so fascinating is this shift in perspective. The goal is control, so the source treats the economy not as a social thing, but as an energy system, like mechanics or electricity.
And if you can measure the energy flow, you can program it, and you can control it. To do that, they needed analogies borrowed directly from electrical engineering.
So if you think of the economy as an electrical circuit, it has 3 key components.
Exactly.
Let's start with the first one, economic capacitance. In electricity, a capacitor stores energy, like a coiled spring.
In economics, capacitance is capital. Money, inventory, investments, that's all stored energy. When a company has billions in cash reserves, or when you have a large savings account, that is potential energy stored in an economic capacitor. It's the system's ability to resist immediate change.
Okay, then we have economic resistance. An electrical resistor dissipates energy, usually as heat. It's friction.
Economically, resistance is frugality. It's represented by goods, the material things being consumed. It's the energy dissipation factor, the friction of daily commerce, where wealth is spent and consumed. High resistance means high frugality and a slower economic velocity.
And the last one, the one that's tied directly to people, economic inductance.
Yeah.
Or services. It sounds highly analytical.
It is. Inductance in physics is inertia. It's kinetic energy in motion. It's the tendency of a mass or a current to resist speeding up or slowing down.
So how does that apply to people?
Inductance is inherently tied to population activity and inertia. Think about cultural habits, consumer confidence, or how long it takes people to adopt a new technology. When you introduce a change, like a new tax, it takes time for the population to adjust.
That delay. That's the inductance.
That time delay, that behavioral drag, that refusal of the mass to immediately accelerate or stop, that's economic inductance. It's a measure of how much the population's behavior resists change.
So they are trying to mathematically measure the population's collective sluggishness. I mean, that's terrifying. It means you can model human behavior as just another variable in the circuit.
And once you have the model, you have to test it. The document borrows the concept of the shock test from airframe engineering.
Where you fire a projectile at a plane's wing and measure the echo and vibration to see where it will fail.
Exactly. They call it flicker or flutter. When you apply that to economics, you have to create controlled stress to measure the system's reaction.
So you create violent price fluctuations or shocks.
On stable, sensitive commodities, not luxury goods, things that are benchmarks like beef, coffee, or sugar.
And these shocks are supposed to be immediate and really noticeable.
Yes. And by rapidly monitoring how consumers react, how they shift their budgets, change their buying habits on related goods, or put off big purchases, they can map the exact economic and psychological structure of the public.
So the testing is to find the collective failure point. It's to predict exactly how the population will respond to any sudden stress, so the system engineers can manipulate the circuit with precision.
The stated goal of all this engineering is to turn society into a predictable, manageable, almost drugged animal, all managed by a high-speed automated control system.
For that to work, you'd need to track everything, not just in general, but down to every single person.
Right. And remember, this document is supposedly from 1979. It was already looking ahead to some very sophisticated tracking.
The source actually names technologies that existed or were just emerging then.
It does. Credit cards, the UPC, the Universal Product Code, barcodes on everything, every purchase providing a data point.
And then it makes this chilling prediction about future tech.
Specifically, the use of subcutaneous body implant tags, an unseen number under the skin to identify individual consumers.
The implication is just crystal clear. Every transaction, every service, every bit of capital has to be monitored to provide the data to manage the inductance, resistance, and capacitance of the whole system in real time.
And if that economic control is successful, the document makes a claim that is just. It's fundamental to its entire philosophy.
Which is what?
That this kind of servitude, this silent economic slavery, is actually necessary for social stability and order. It ensures that leadership stays with the educated upper class.
But to get that total control, they had to deal with the one social component that resists pure math, the family unit. Why is the family so hard to quantify?
Because it introduces all these nonlinear, unpredictable variables. Emotion, tradition, identity, loyalty. These things interrupt the system's smooth flow of energy.
So the family structure itself has to be targeted.
Structurally targeted. And the document details some pretty harsh strategies to do it. The first is just simple financial disruption.
You make it financially impossible for the father to question the system.
By making him work long hours of low-pay labor from a very young age. The goal is just distraction and exhaustion. When the primary breadwinner is economically crushed and physically tired, they don't have the mental space or the time to educate themselves, to participate, or even to fully care for their own kids.
Which leads right into the next step, child separation.
Since the father is too distracted, the state steps in. It helps create these large subsidized child care centers. The goal is to remove the child from parental influence as early as possible and replace it with the state's narrative.
And this is where the chemical intervention comes in.
Yes. The source explicitly cites the inoculation of the child with a dose of Ritalin. It says it's a way to chemically accelerate the child's transition away from the family and into the state-controlled environment.
This all underpins the political relationship the system wants to create.
Yeah.
Which is dependency.
Exactly. The populace is described as suffering from laziness, fear, and self-interest. This makes them want a human god, a political figure, who will just take away all their life problems and run things for them.
And that's the perfect environment for the welfare system to become a strategic weapon.
It's cited as a key tool against a dependent population. It fosters a state of sustained compliance and debt-based submission. It's control through dependence.
The final conclusion the document draws from this perspective is just, it's brutal.
It is. It argues that citizens who refuse to cultivate their intellect, who refuse to deal with their own problems, are functionally no better than beasts. And because of that, they're incapable of avoiding a silent war that's waged against them without any religious or ethical objections.
So if we pull all this together, what is the silent weapon, really?
At the end of the day, it's not just economics. It's a form of total warfare. It targets the vitality, the cognitive choices, and the ability to manage resources of every individual, physically, mentally, and emotionally. The core mechanism is the continuous psychological and economic stress, engineered to push the population toward a state of compliant collapse.
And this connects directly back to you, the listener. The sources argue that this system only works if the population is successfully distracted and made non-critical. The defense strategy is pretty clear.
It is. The only way to resist a system that's based on an information imbalance is through the relentless pursuit of knowledge, especially the foundational knowledge they claim is being deliberately withheld.
The sources really emphasize that real math, real history, real law. Those are the keys. The keys to exposing the mechanics of the circuit and resisting the inertia of the system.
Ultimately, the document claims the public makes its own servitude possible. By preferring ignorance, by believing in the free lunch mentality, everything now, pay later.
And the system's logic is that if the public won't curb its own greed, there are only two alternatives to this silent slavery: mass destruction through constant war or gradual technological control.
So it leaves you with a really provocative thought.
It does. What immediate small actions can you take today to truly regulate your own passions, to reduce your own need for that instant gratification, and to actively demand the knowledge you need to maintain intellectual sovereignty over your own life? Something to mull over until our next deep dive.